Hello, dear reader, and welcome to our Dracula Read Along. I'm your host, Monica Van Fleet. I am an independent researcher and writer based out of Philadelphia. Chapter 2 contains several of the most iconic quotes in the book. So far, we have been following Jonathan Harker's very strange journey into Transylvania, and we are picking up Chapter 2 with Jonathan. It is still May 5th. When we meet up with Jonathan in Chapter 2, he says that he thinks he must have fallen asleep because Castle Dracula is huge and he didn't notice the castle as the carriage was approaching. The carriage driver removes Jonathan's luggage and then drives off, leaving Jonathan outside the castle. He says that there isn't a knocker or any sort of bell, so Jonathan's not sure how he's going to be able to get inside. He stands outside and he thinks to himself that he's just going to have to wait until morning and figure out what to do next. He sees a light coming from inside, and then Dracula opens the door in somewhat the theatrical manner. On page 24 of the Norton Critical Edition, he says that he hears heavy steps, and then I saw through the chinks the gleam of a coming light. Then there was the sound of rattling chains and the clanking of massive bolts drawn back. A key was turned with the loud grating sound of long disuse, and the great door swung back. This scene is another clue into the dream state that we mentioned in Chapter 1. There are still several mentions of Jonathan sleeping and him being unsure if he's even awake. Count Dracula opens the door, and Jonathan says that he is a tall, thin man with a long white mustache who's clad all in black, without a single speck of color on him. He invites Jonathan inside, and this is an interesting bit that's a bit of a role reversal from the traditional way that vampires have to be invited inside, because he's inviting Jonathan inside, and he actually invites Jonathan in 3 times. On the first time, he gestures him inside, but he doesn't step over the threshold himself. Once inside, Jonathan and the Count shake hands, and he describes the Count's grip as so strong it makes him wince. And then we get the second invitation, in which Dracula says to Jonathan, "Welcome to my house. Come freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." Jonathan says, "Count Dracula," to confirm the identity of his host. And after that, we get the third invitation. He says, "I am Dracula, and I bid you welcome, Mr. Harker, to my house. Come in, the night air is chill, and you must need to eat and rest." These 3 invitations are something to pay attention to, and the number 3 is actually something that's going to arise again and again. I really think this is one of the most important parts of Chapter 2, because Stoker is implying Jonathan is actually complicit in his own captivity in Castle Dracula. We know this because in the production of Faust, Henry Irving as Mephistopheles has to have 3 explicit invitations into Faust's study before he enters, and it's part of that idea of a Faustian bargain. The devil doesn't just want to seduce your soul away from you, he wants you to offer it. So in saying, "Yes, I'm going to come into your house, I'm willingly entering," Jonathan is saying, "Yes, I agree to this arrangement." In The Mysterious Stranger, there's a line that is appropriated for the 1979 film Dracula. "If my company does not please you at any time, you will have yourself to blame for an acquaintance with one who seldom forces himself, but is difficult to shake off." Then Count Dracula takes Jonathan's luggage and sees him aside. We might think today that Count Dracula is just being polite, but this would have been severely abnormal to Jonathan. Dracula is a count. Jonathan is, until very recently, a solicitor's clerk. The fact that he is acting as Jonathan's servant is significant and would be very weird and disorienting to Jonathan. The idea that he does not have servants aiding him regardless of the hour, and that he himself is waiting on Jonathan, would be extremely strange from a class perspective in Victorian England. Jonathan gives Dracula the letter from Mr. Hawkins explaining why it's Jonathan there instead of his employer, and we get a deeper description of Dracula. Jonathan describes Dracula as having red eyes, bushy eyebrows that almost meet together over the eyes, pointy ears, protruding teeth, coarse hands, and broad, squat fingers with hair in the hollow of his palms and long, pointed fingernails. He also uses the word aquiline to describe Count Dracula's nose. This is interesting to call out because an aquiline nose is also called a Roman nose. And from a physiognomy standpoint in Victorian England, it would be connected to someone who was a fighter. At the time, it was becoming associated as a trope with Jewishness, but it's also still describing that time where these generals and these men of action are described as having an aquiline nose. George Washington was described as having an aquiline nose. So while while there is absolutely a connection there to anti-Semitism, it is also a mention of the physiognomy that was important in the Victorian era. They thought that literally you could understand someone's characteristics based on their physical features. So after this incredibly serious moment, the Count touches Jonathan's shoulder, and Jonathan shudders because he thinks that Dracula's breath is rank. The Count notices and pulls back, which is followed by an awkward silence. And I just think this is a moment of the physical comedy of Dracula that frequently is missed because it is such an intense piece of fiction. Stoker really does a good job of balancing these moments of incredible anxiety with moments of levity to inject a little bit of humor into the story. Following this, we get another of the most iconic lines in the entire book because wolves start howling outside the castle and Dracula pauses and enjoys the sound and says, "Listen to them, the children of the night, what music they make." Jonathan reacts kind of strangely to this, and Dracula notices and says, "Oh, well, maybe you don't get it because you're a city dweller." This line is also interesting to me because it is a reference to a line that was in a book by Lady Jane Wilde, who was Oscar Wilde's mother. Lady Jane Wilde and Bram Stoker were incredibly close friends. Oscar and Bram were never as close as anyone might think. They were kind of more frenemies, but Bram was incredibly close with Lady Wilde, and she very much acted as a mentor to Bram, particularly when he was still located in Dublin. And so this line is actually a reference that Lady Wilde makes in her book, Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland, which was published in 1887. She describes the berserker-like warrior tribes of Celtic prehistory. And the quote from her book is, "From long wandering through the gloomy regions where the sun is darkened by perpetual clouds, they call themselves the children of the night and look on her as the primal mother in all things." I think this is so interesting because the year after Henry Irving passes away, Bram Stoker releases a 2-volume book called Personal Reminiscences of Henry Irving. And it is the first biography released on Henry after his death. In that entire book, there is not one single reference made to Oscar Wilde. But we know that their lives were incredibly intertwined and that Oscar would have been visiting the Lyceum Theater. We know that he wrote a poem for Henry Irving years in the past, and his name is never in Personal Reminiscences. But Dracula does have a few references that, while they may not be directly to Oscar, they would have been very meaningful to Lady Jane Wilde. On May 7th, Jonathan recounts the activities of May 6th. He says that he slept in, and he comments that he thinks it's weird that there's no servants or mirrors. He notes that the possessions that Dracula has are old, but they're very valuable. He gets bored in his own room and wanders around and finds a library that has many English books, but none of them are particularly in date. At that point, Dracula comes in and says that he's glad that Jonathan found his way into the library because there's going to be much in that room to interest him. Dracula calls the books his friends and says that he's been reading since he got the idea to go to England, and he only knows the English language because of books. Jonathan protests and says Dracula's English is fantastic, but Dracula says that he wants to blend in when he's in England. Then he clarifies and says that Jonathan may go wherever he wants to go in the castle as long as the doors are not locked. Dracula says they're in Transylvania, and Transylvania ways might be different to Jonathan, but here he is the master and boyar, which is their word for the nobility, and he doesn't want to lose status. This is actually significant because this gives us a clue to why Jonathan had to be in Transylvania. As Dracula is making his journey to England, he doesn't want to be seen as a foreigner when he arrives. The reason that he wanted Jonathan to come here is so that he could observe an actual Englishman and understand the way that Jonathan speaks and his mannerisms to help Dracula assimilate when he arrives in England. They have a conversation, and Jonathan says that the Count is very forthcoming. He says that occasionally he does try to steer the conversation. Jonathan asks Dracula about the Blue Flames, and Jonathan learns about the Blue Flames connection to fortune hunting. He asks why the treasure would still be there after all this time, and Dracula says that it's because the peasants that are in their houses cowering in fear can't be courageous. He's insinuating that they are not capable of courage as peasants. And besides, even if you tried to go back the next day, if you saw the Blue Flames, could you figure out exactly where it was? And Jonathan says, well, I guess not. You got me there, basically. At this point, the Count asks about his new estate in England, and Jonathan leaves to get his papers. When he comes back, the tables have been cleared, and Dracula is on the couch reading an English Bradshaw guide, which is a book of times tables for English trains. So maybe a little bit awkward, because what exactly does he need to memorize the train schedules for that are out of date? They discuss Dracula's purchase of his new home in Purfleet, and Jonathan says that it's called Carfax. He notes this is probably because the house has 4 sides and its representation of Quatrefoss. This is also signifying a crossroads. Crossroads are where suicides were buried. This is something that Bram Stoker was aware of. It was believed in the folklore that suicides could become vampires. Jonathan shows the Count pictures of his new house and refers to them as Kodaks. He says that there's not very many other homes around, but that one that is close by has been turned into a private lunatic asylum. Dracula seems really happy with the purchase, and then we get what I lovingly call the Goth speech. In the Norton Critical Edition, it is on page 33, in which Dracula says, "I am glad that it is old and big. I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love not to think that our bones may be amongst the common dead. I seek not gaiety nor mirth, not the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling waters, which please the young and gay. I am no longer young, and my heart, through weary years of mourning over the dead, is not attuned to mirth. Moreover, the walls of my castle are broken. The shadows are many, and the wind breathes cold through the broken battlements and casements. I love the shade and the shadow, and would be alone with my thoughts when I may." Jonathan's next entry is on May 8th. He says that he's glad that he has been detailed in his journal writings because there's certainly weird things going on, and he hints that he thinks that there are no other living souls in the castle. Jonathan hasn't seen a single servant in this entire time, and he thinks there's no one else here except for himself and Dracula. Jonathan sleeps just a few hours, and in the morning he's shaving when Dracula comes in, and he notices that Dracula doesn't cast a reflection in the mirror. Startled, Jonathan cuts himself, and the sight of the blood makes Dracula raise. He goes to grab Jonathan, but Jonathan moves away and touches the cross, which seems to calm Dracula. Dracula says, "Be careful when you cut yourself because it's dangerous here." Then he takes Jonathan's shaving mirror and throws it out the window, calling it a foul bauble of man's vanity. Then Jonathan is annoyed because how will he shave? Later, Jonathan goes to the dining room and, not seeing the Count, he breakfasts alone. At this point, Jonathan has been here for about 48 hours, and he thinks it's very odd that he hasn't seen the Count eat or drink. Afterwards, Jonathan explores the castle, and he notes that the castle is located on a precipice with sheer cliff on 3 sides. Then he notices the doors are all locked, and while he could jump out the window, that likely wouldn't lead to safety. So at this point, Jonathan realizes he cannot get out, and he is a prisoner. In this week's deep dive, we're going to go a bit deeper into the Victorian pseudoscience of physiognomy. We're also going to talk a little bit about Victorian ideals of class and how we see them throughout the text of Dracula. In chapter 3, not only do we get several really interesting quotes, but we get one of the most key scenes in the entire book, where Dracula saves Jonathan from the 3 vampire women.